Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will talk about a topic which is very important for many reasons, especially the question, what happens in the brain of patients when they are undergoing different kinds of psychotherapy, which is a $1 billion or €1 billion question. And there is one dominating hypothesis, which comes from the so-called cognitive behavioral therapy, and says depressed patients suffer from a wrong view of the world. So the world for them appears to be too much frightening, too depressing, and there is a deficit in the cortical control of the subcortical centers like amygdala, which always tell to us the world is frightening, the world is bad. So one should be depressed, but the cortical control consists in the reasoning the world is not as bad as it would like to the amygdala. So depressed patients suffer, this is a popular idea, from this cortical control, from the dodolateral prefrontal cortex, for example, to the amygdala. Here, this is the dodolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of reasoning, of intelligence, and this should tell the amygdala, for example, the world is not as bad as you see. So, with the help of therapy, cognitive therapy, or any kind of therapy, you should increase, or the therapist should be able to increase again the cognitive control. So there's a hypofunctionality of the dodolateral prefrontal cortex and a hyperactivity of the amygdala predominantly. And this is what you really find in all the studies, and as I will show you in a second, we found it too. And this should be reversed during a successful psychotherapy, especially during a cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a reframing of the worldview. However, many studies, or several studies, who were made on depressed patients after a certain psychotherapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy, they found just the opposite. There is a very famous study, Goldapple et al., which was supported by Helen Mayberg, one of the leading American psychotherapists, and they predicted the dodolateral prefrontal cortex. Does somebody have a laser pointer, because mine is not working? Yeah. So the prediction is, after a certain kind of therapy, the dodolateral prefrontal cortex should go up due to cognitive reframing. So the patient learns the world is not as bad. What, however, Goldapple and Helen Mayberg found, it further goes down, which makes absolutely no sense. Other studies showed that even the ventral anterior cingulate cortex goes down, which again should go up because the anterior cingulate cortex evaluates the suffering and said, yeah, you should feel better. And the basal ganglia and other parts, subcortical parts, should go down because they are being more controlled after therapy. Instead, they go up. Absolutely no sense at all. And this is one of the best studies in the world. And this has repeated many times. And people found always the same. Either there's nothing in the dodolateral prefrontal cortex or it goes down. Just the opposite of what cognitive behavioral therapy would predict. Anyway, my colleagues and I, 3 years ago, in the Hande Institute for Advanced Study, asked ourselves, how could it come that all those studies, maybe 10, 15 studies, until today, give so confusing results? Absolutely no sense. And we found First, there's a huge heterogeneity of methods applied. Some use PET, some fMRI, some SPECT. And accordingly, there are very different types of spatial and temporal resolution possibilities, which are inconsistent. Insufficient neuroanatomical localization. Some people just say the frontal cortex did something. The frontal cortex consists at least of 25 very different areas. Dorsal, lateral, ventral, medial, and so on. Unclear diagnostics, for example, comorbidities, medication effect, nothing was respected. And furthermore, in many of those studies, there was small sample size, 6 to 8 patients, psychotherapy of 6 to 8 weeks, because this is very expensive. But within 6 or 8 weeks, you can see nothing. And furthermore, often there were no healthy controls, which is just makes no sense at all. And finally, what they mostly measured is resting state of the brains of depressed patients, no provocation. And so these are mistakes that are just unreasonable. You can predict no reasonable, result that makes sense could come up. So after discovering the severe deficits of those studies, and the other fact that there was so far no study about the effect of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy, in 2008 we concluded we should do such a study, and we selected some money. And luckily enough, at that time, I was the director of the Hanse Institute, and we had a substantial share of our fMRI machine at the University of Bremen. And furthermore, I had enough money to sponsor this study, which at the end costed €1 million, which is not so little. And furthermore, we decided to do this study over 2 years, which is a normal effort. So there were many people, there are psychotherapists, neurobiologists, and technicians, and we started in 2008. This is now being called the Hanse Neuropsychoanalytic Study, and this has been, in the meantime, this has been published already, at least partly, and we started with the collaboration with 20 experienced psychoanalysts of 2 psychoanalytic institutes in Bremen. They gave us access to the patients. We started with 70 patients, then recruited 20 of them, or 24, but 5 dropped out, so at the very end we had 19. But these 19 stayed for 2 years, which was completely unexpected this was possible. Accordingly, we had 19 matched controls, sex, age, education. And this was the material, and this was just for free. In the United States, where my friend and colleague Eric Kandel tried to do this, the costs are enormous because they have to pay for the patients for therapy, which is cost enormous amount. It was for free. So what at the very beginning we did is to check whether the patients were really depressed. So we used the Beck depressant inventory, and here the red rates are here are the BDI score. And you see there's almost no overlap between healthy controls and depressed patients. So we avoided any kind of comorbidity except anxiety disorders, which is inevitable because almost all depressed patients have anxiety disorders. But any other comorbidity was avoided. Now, we made another trick. We started with pictures from the IAPS, from the International Effective Picture Series, of normal, pleasant, unpleasant, and frightening pictures, and it didn't work at all in the depressed patient. No effect. And then we had the idea, some of us had the idea, let's use a certain framework, which is called operationalized psychodynamic diagnostic, which is a worldwide diagnostic tool. And people were interviewed by professionals, And out of the long interviews, we selected 4 short sentences where both the controls and the patients said, this describes exactly what I'm suffering from. 4 short sentences. I will give you an example. And when they were put in the functional MRI, in the MRI machine, they heard these sentences where they had agreed before, this described absolutely exactly my suffering. These were the OPD sentences. And then we had more sentences, which they heard during staying in the MRI, which was a relaxed situation. Just be calm, imagine something pleasant, and so on. Then a unspecific or a stress situation not related to the suffering, not to depression, which is imagine that somebody is behaving cruelly in the traffic and so on, and you imagine some traffic stress, and then the OPD sentences, which are really concentrating on the suffering of the patients. We put them into our MRI scanner. Now we have a new one, but at that time we had the Siemens Allega scanner, and there were the relaxation sentences, the unspecific stress sentences, and the OPD generated individual sentences, right? Different sentences for each control and each patient. And 30 minutes presentation, and they listened to the sentences, and they had the task to think about and to emotionally concentrate on what the sentences said. For example, they read, I wish to be accepted by others. Therefore, I do a lot for them. That is often too close for them, so they retreat. Then I feel empty and lonesome, for example. And the depressed patient, even because they had to emotionally concentrate on this situation. What were the results at the very beginning, at T1, which is published a year ago? And what we found at the very beginning, so we have 3 cases. This is relaxation sentences, traffic stress, and then the depressing sentences. The blue ones are the controls, and the red ones are the patients. So in a large variety of limbic centers, of cortical and subcortical limbic centers, for example, the amygdala and or the superior temporal gyrus, paracentral lobus, here the amygdala, the claustrum. So we measured almost everything. We saw that this is activity. So in the relaxation center, there was a huge difference between depressed patients and the controls. So the controls enjoyed much more the relaxation centers than the depressed patient, which makes sense. Then normal stress, there was some difference or no difference, but here, if it came to the OPD sentences, then there was a huge arousal in all those limbic centers in the patients compared to the controls. So the patients were much more aroused and excited by their specific suffering sentences than the controls, although the controls suffered from some anxiety and depression, but not in a pathological thing. So this was very good. For example, here, the amygdala was strongly increased in the patients in contrast to the controls, which was good because if we hadn't found differences between controls and depressed patients at the very beginning, we would just give up. Would make no sense, but luckily there was huge difference in the related limbic subcortical center, which you would expect. The amygdala has a hyperarousal with respect to the suffering in the patients. Now, These are other pictures. Okay. So then what happened 1 year, roughly 1 year of treatment? I will show you only the results after 1 year, but I can tell you the results after 2 years are more or less the same. So to make a long story short, the first question is, what was the suffering of the patients? Did it go down during 1 or 2 years? And this exactly is the case. The controls didn't suffer very much. You see the blue circles and triangles at T1 and T2 after 1 year. But there was a substantial reduction of suffering in the BDI index between T1 and T2 after 1 year. So they reported, we are feeling more relaxed, better, and so on. Which is good, very good. So there was an improvement during psychotherapy after 1 year, which we hoped and which we would expect. However, this is the question of adequacy and arousal in both controls and patients. It could be that controls as well as patients could just get adapted during 1 or 2 years to those sentences. The sentence didn't have enough arousal effect anymore, which, however, in the controls was not the case. There was no significant decrease, only very slight, in the adequacy and in the arousal. The control said, oh yes, they are arousing us, although it's not psychopathological, but it's still very effective. But in contrast, the patients, after 1 year, significantly showed differences. They did find the sentences less adequate and less arousing here with respect to a year ago, which was somehow, at the first glance, surprising. They said they don't interest us anymore. And now, what's going on in the brain? This is, for example, in the right amygdala, in the right putamen, caudatum, here. And you see the blue ones are the controls, the second ones, the red ones are the patients. You see they're almost indistinguishable, although a year before there was strong, highly significant difference. This one. So the patients had become better, they felt better, and in the brain there was almost no difference anymore. But what happened in specific parts of the brain? For example, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is very important because it tells the patient or the subject to attend what happened. For example, to concentrate on their suffering. How the pain, the psychological pain they are suffering, is expressed, among others, by the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex. And here it is, these are relative values, although this strongly goes up. This doesn't mean that it really goes up in absolute sense, because as you might know, functional fMRI measures only the differences. But in the traffic stress, the patients were suffering after 1 year of treatment more than the controls, but in the OPD sentences, the controls were much more sensitive to the OPD sentences than the patients. The patients paid less attention to these sentences. They cared less about what they heard about their own depression, which is exactly what you find here. And this is no artifact, because in the controls there was no difference. And this is what we found. The sensitivity, as measured by the Beck depression index, decreases significantly, but they are still suffering from the depression. So after 1 year, even after 2 years, as almost every psychotherapist will say, there is no fundamental release from depression. They just feel better. But the question is, what is the substance of feeling better? Is it that there's healing, there is just absolute disappearance of depression? A psychotherapist would say no. There is no final healing from suffering. That's just that the patients engage less in their suffering. They care less with respect to their depressed ideas and emotions. And this is exactly what we found. So while the initial overactivity of subcortical limbic centers goes up, the amygdala goes up, and the limbic cortical areas go down. For example, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is absolutely opposite to what cognitive psychotherapy would predict. And this means there is no cognitive restructuring. In the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex of hundreds of measurements, there was absolutely no change, which was found even by many other people, including Helen Mayberg, or even depression. So if we generalize what we found, it confirms what many psychotherapists assume. What happens during psychotherapy is not a complete rewiring in the amygdala, for example, a healing, going back to normal state, but just a change in attitude toward our suffering. And if this is the case, then we have to understand the effect of psychotherapy in a completely different way. It's not cognitive reframing and restructuring, but it's emotional adaptiveness to my suffering. What will go on, will happen within other 3 or 5 years, we do not know. This would mean that we lose our patients and we had to pay 3 or 4 more million euro, which is impossible. So, but let's say after 2 years, we get a grasp of what seems to happen in the brain during successful psychotherapy. Thank you much.